January 16th, 1969, a young philosophy student named Jan Palach walked into the center of Prague, Czechoslovakia. He was carrying a briefcase and a very small canister of petrol. Now this day was a day just like any other in Czechoslovakia. Nobody had any reason to believe that anything extraordinary was about to happen. It was about mid-afternoon. People were on their break from work and going to meet each other for lunch and for coffee. This is when Jan Palach decided to walk up to the steps of the National Museum that was overlooking the entire city. There, he set down his briefcase and opened his can of petrol. Palach poured the petrol over his entire body. Then, he took out a match and struck it before setting himself on fire. He screamed as the flames engulfed him, stumbling forward for a number of steps, before witnesses rushed forward to put out the flames. Ultimately, however, their efforts were in vain, as Palach ended up in hospital where he died from his wounds 3 days later. In this video, I want to tell you the story of Jan Palach, but not only his story, but the story of the system that motivated him to take his own life in such a dramatic and devastating fashion, and how that system in which Palach lived bears a lot of similarities to the system that young people and students find themselves living in today. First things first, I have to do a little bit of housekeeping. Obviously, this video is going to discuss some quite heavy topics, including, but not limited to, suicide, political violence, and war. YouTube does not take kindly to these topics being spoken about in an uncensored and unfiltered way, but I have no intention of censoring or filtering my language in this video, because I trust that you, the viewer, who clicked on it, are able to deal with these heavy themes, again, in an uncensored way. And you understand also why it's important for me to do that. That said, obviously the topic of this video is quite heavy, so if you're not in a great frame of mind today, all I would ask is that you put the video in your watch later playlist and come back to it when you are feeling maybe in a better mood or more able to deal with the heavy topic of this video. For me, there are going to be consequences to this. Obviously, this video might end up getting suppressed. I don't really care, because I trust that if you find the video good enough, if you find it informative, or you like the presentation style, then you will share it with people who you also think will find it interesting, and the video will get its reach that way. So, without any further ado, let's get back into the story of Jan Palach and the system that drove him to despair. In his suicide note, Jan Palach wrote, "Our nation is sliding towards complete demoralization. In order to awaken the people, we have decided to set ourselves on fire." It follows from this that to understand why Jan Palach set himself on fire, we first need to understand the world that he lived in, the world that drove him to commit such an extreme action. Czechoslovakia in the 1960s was a country suffering under the thumb of Soviet control. The Communist Party had ruled in Czechoslovakia for the past 20 years, and they had ruled with an absolute iron fist. Art was completely censored, travel was restricted, and political protest was always crushed violently. However, by the end of the 1960s, when Palach set himself on fire, cracks had been beginning to emerge in this system. You see, communism was changing in Czechoslovakia in the late 60s. In 1967, the Communist Party elected a new leader with a completely new vision for the country. This man's name was Alexander Dubček, and his vision was called socialism with a human face. And this term always makes me laugh or smile whenever I hear it, because if you're only getting to socialism with a human face, after 20 years of being in power, what the hell came before it? What kind of monstrosities were you doing? Now, this question is actually quite easy to answer. Czechoslovakia, like most of the communist countries at this time, was undergoing Stalinism. People were just getting thrown to the gulag left, right, and center before socialism with a human face. So in short, socialism with a human face was to be a correction against 2 decades of Stalinist oppression in the country. For the first time in a very long time, newspapers were allowed to criticize the government, and their writers could publish whatever the hell they wanted to. Students could organize protest movements, and people, by and large, could speak freely without fear of being ostracized from society, without fear of losing their job, or without fear of being punished in even worse ways than these. This period in Czechoslovakia became known as the Prague Spring. It was a brief, intoxicating moment where the entire nation believed that it could achieve its own freedom. And Jan Palach grew up as part of this generation. He was just 19 years old when the Prague Spring began. He was a philosophy student at the main university in his country. A very exciting time and a very exciting place to be for a young person. In fact, he had just transferred from economics to philosophy. This is perhaps because he was struggling to answer some of the bigger questions, such as what it meant to be human, all too human, in a system that had previously seemed to crush the human spirit at every available opportunity. Unfortunately for Jan Palach, the protagonist of this video, the Prague Spring was destined not to last. You see, the Soviet Union was watching with a very, very careful eye from the east the developments that were happening in Czechoslovakia. And the Soviet leadership was worried about these developments. They could see Czechoslovakia drifting further and further away from orthodox communism, and there was a real fear that Czechoslovakia would eventually transform itself into a liberal democracy. Now you have to remember here that the Soviet Union was in the middle of the Cold War against the United States, and to have one of its allies, Czechoslovakia, defect and join the other side, the Soviet Union was not having this at all. On August 21st, 1968, just 5 months before Palach set himself on fire, the Soviet Union ordered 500,000 communist troops to invade Czechoslovakia. They came in the middle of the night, with tanks rolling through the streets of Prague. Now, I have to make clear at this point that this was more than just a run-of-the-mill military occupation. This was a psychological catastrophe for the people of Czechoslovakia. Imagine, if you will, for a moment, believing for the first time in your life that change, real change, was possible in your country, and that you had the agency to go out and make that happen. And then, one morning, you wake up to see your country occupied, and all of that hope has completely vanished overnight. This was the crushing psychological phenomenon that Jan Palach and countless others in Czechoslovakia now faced. After the invasion, the reformist leader Alexander Dubček was pressured, first of all, into rolling back all his reforms and then resigning. Censorship was reintroduced. Restrictions on travel became widespread once again, and no longer were students or anyone else allowed to criticize their government. Strict adherence to Marxist-Leninist ideology once again became the only way that you could get ahead in Czechoslovak society. This process of, first of all, taking away and then repressing freedom in Czechoslovakia was given a rather ominous sounding name. It was called normalisation. Basically, under normalisation, Czechoslovaks were no longer allowed to criticize the bureaucrats who ran their country. Also, any agency that they had to change things for the better politically was completely taken away. This had an absolutely devastating psychological impact on people. Now, Czechoslovaks had no reason to pursue or even imagine a better future for their country. It was simply considered an impossibility after the invasion that anything could ever be changed for the better again. And this created a unique and deep kind of despair in people. They became completely alienated from the system that they were in. They now knew that it didn't serve them, but they also knew that they were completely powerless to change it. You may be beginning to see parallels to our own time there, at least psychologically. Jan Palach was watching all of this unfold, but he was becoming increasingly isolated and desperate at the same time. His fellow students had begun adapting to the new normal. They were keeping their heads down and getting on with their studies. Above him, the older generation were retreating back into their private lives and leaving public life to the authorities who had been installed. Jan Palach was experiencing all around him the psychology of normalisation. The gradual acceptance that change is completely impossible. Or, to use a modern term, that nothing ever happens. People stop trying to change the system around them. They no longer believe that such change is possible. And then they retreat into their own comfortable, private lives. In his suicide note, Jan Palach wrote about the lethargy of Czech people after the invasion. And this lethargy is the real spirit of normalisation. A gradual loss of hope in the future among ordinary people. And Palach set himself on fire to try and reignite this hope. Reigniting this hope was definitely part of Palach's wider plan. In his suicide note, Palach wrote about a group of people who supposedly had made the decision to set themselves on fire together, and he was the first person to go ahead and do this. However, historians now believe that no such group ever actually existed. In a sense, this was Palach's way of making his act seem like it was part of a wider movement that was designed to shock the populace into taking action, to prevent more young people from setting themselves on fire. Now, we know that this motivation is true because Palach actually wrote 3 letters. He wrote one to the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia, he wrote one to the Czechoslovak people, and he wrote one to his family. In these letters, Palach made 2 demands. He demanded an end to censorship and a withdrawal of all the occupying troops in his country. He then signed the letters. But he did not sign these letters as Jan Palach. Instead, he signed them as Torch Number 1, again implying that more people would set themselves on fire if his demands were not met. At first, it seemed like Palach's plan was going to work. His death sparked mass demonstrations across Czechoslovakia, and his funeral became a massive protest event, with students organizing their own demonstrations and workers walking out of their factories to be in attendance. For this very, very brief moment, it did seem like the Czech people were waking up from their lethargy, as Palach predicted. However, the Communist Party quickly regained control of this situation. They arrested protesters, they shut down newspapers who were covering the event, and they began a massive smear campaign to discredit Palach's legacy. Amongst other things, the Communist Party called Palach insane, a CIA agent, and most bizarrely of all, they claimed that his death had been an accident. Because matches can light themselves, apparently. More importantly, the Communist Party demonstrated something that modern governments have become extraordinarily adept at. This is the ability to absorb and neutralize even the most extreme forms of protest. The Communist Party didn't need to acknowledge Palach's demands or give in to them. They simply needed to wait for the shock of his death to wear off and then swoop in and re-establish control over the situation. Now, we have proof that the Communist Party were able to re-establish power after Jan Palach's death. We know this because just a month after Palach died, on February 25th of 1969, another student named Jan Zajic went to the exact same spot and set himself on fire too. Zajic was followed by several others. A total of 26 people attempted to set themselves on fire between January and April of 1969 in Czechoslovakia. And this cascade of suicide events shows something important about the psychology of extreme protest. When people feel that they have no normal political alternative to pursue change, they will resort to extreme measures like the ones that we could see in Czechoslovakia. None of these deaths ended up sparking the same level of protest or outrage as Jan Palach's did. By now, the general public were becoming numb to the shock of these suicides. In addition to this, the authorities had learned to deal with the aftermath of these suicides much more effectively. And the populace was beginning to learn that no matter how extremely they were going to protest against the occupation, nothing was going to change the situation. The great Czech novelist Milan Kundera wrote about this psychological effect in his book, The Joke. In this book, Kundera creates characters who outwardly conform and publicly agree to the system in which they live, but inwardly they hold very different opinions and live very, very different lives. This kind of psychological splitting becomes evident in any kind of society that undergoes normalization. Of course, this psychological splitting comes at a cost. When people stop believing that their actions can influence the larger world around them, they become alienated from it, and they become passive spectators in their own history. Now, this is where the Palach story becomes incredibly relevant to our own time. I know many young people across many countries who all share a similar sense of heaviness, of psychological splitting. This is largely because we're being absolutely pulverized by the global economy, and we have very, very little agency to do anything to change it in our favor politically. We are largely represented by bureaucratic politicians who serve the interests of that economic system and their big donors, rather than the interests of young people who are financially powerless. And this has led to a number of attitudes becoming completely normalized in our generation, such as the belief that we'll never be able to retire, that we'll never be able to own our own homes, that although we may want to start our own families, we completely lack the resources to be able to do this, and we will continue to lack those resources for a long time indeed. We may not live in dictatorships like the Soviet Union, but there is a strong sense of demoralization among Gen Z in particular, all the same. Our capacity to imagine our future better and brighter is fading sharply. Why bother when you have such little agency to make a meaningful change? In addition to this, our governments have become remarkably adept at managing our dissatisfaction. We can protest as much as we want. We can voice our concerns online as much as we want. Both of these act as a massive release valve for our tensions, but nothing ever ends up happening. The governments can channel these forms of protest into bureaucratic processes that take years, sometimes even decades, to resolve themselves, by which point most people have given up the fight and given up the cause that they were protesting for in the first place. In addition to this, the governments can use media manipulation. They can do this to discredit protest movements or people that they don't particularly like, that pose a massive threat to the economic system. Or they can simply wait for the news cycle to move on to the next big event and allow things to blow over, and eventually return to normal. All of this creates the same kind of alienation that Jan Palach would have felt in Czechoslovakia. People try to engage with the system politically, and they invest a ton of emotional energy in causes that they really believe in, only to watch as their efforts seem to make absolutely no difference whatsoever. Eventually, many people give up and they stop trying, just as they did in post-invasion Czechoslovakia. And this kind of apathy is something that I want to address now at the end of this video. I want to make an argument against this. You see, Jan Palach should have outlived the system that he was protesting against. Just 20 years after his death in November 1989, hundreds of thousands of Czechoslovaks poured out into the streets of Prague for the Velvet Revolution. This was the revolution that brought an end to communism in Czechoslovakia for good. That system, that seemed so permanent when Palach set himself on fire, had now completely collapsed. Only 3 years later, the entire Soviet Union and Soviet bloc was no more. That which had seemed so permanent had completely disappeared in a number of years. Now, none of this happened because of dramatic protests or extreme political action. It happened because the communist system simply became unsustainable over time. A combination of economic stagnation and political alienation among most of the population meant that the system could no longer maintain itself. The normalisation period in Czechoslovakia created a kind of a political freeze. Because dissent was largely suppressed and alternative viewpoints were completely silenced, the system, the communist system, completely lost its ability to respond and generate new ideas to combat changing conditions in the world. The economy in the Soviet world stagnated because there was no mechanism for innovation that allowed it to adapt to changing circumstances in the world. Similarly, the political system became increasingly disconnected from the people it was supposed to serve. Most young people after 1968 grew up in the Soviet bloc with no real connection or affiliation to communism whatsoever. Eventually, the system lost its ability to maintain itself because it had no one who believed in it enough to generate new ideas that would allow it to continue and to maintain its own hegemony. This is the paradox of suppressing protest. Governments that become too good at neutralizing opposing voices end up neutralizing their own ability to adapt and to respond to change, ultimately to survive. They create the very conditions that will lead to their own downfall over time. We can see this dynamic playing out in multiple forms across the world today. Governments that have become expert at managing dissent and protest are also struggling with deeper problems of legitimacy and effectiveness. In many developed democracies, political institutions are rapidly losing the trust of large segments of the population, especially young people. They have completely given up on participating in the system because they no longer believe that it's going to serve their interests. Now, this creates something of a legitimacy crisis. This is a situation where your government can maintain power, but they can't maintain genuine support from the population. These crises, they can last for years or even decades. However, they do create the conditions for radical change to happen very, very quickly. This is because when people no longer believe that gradual reform is possible through political action, they become very, very open to taking more extreme and radical forms of political action themselves. Now, this is the trap that someone like Jan Palach fell into, and that many young people today are falling into as well. This is the belief that if the change you desire doesn't happen immediately, then it simply will never happen at all. This is the belief that your bad circumstances are absolutely doomed to last forever. And this kind of belief, if you really cling on to it, creates the kind of despair and alienation that drives you to commit these kind of politically violent actions that often do more harm than good. Now, this psychology is very, very seductive to people because If the system that you're protesting is irredeemably corrupt, if normal politics appears to be impossible and all other forms of protest are ineffective, then your particular despair becomes justified. This is the kind of logic that led Jan Palach to take his own life in extreme circumstances, and it also leads other people today to embark on forms of political violence and self-destruction. Think about somebody like Luigi Mangione. You could say that his cause was justified. The US healthcare system is quite corrupt and it's quite broken. But was his action, was his response proportional? Was it successful? I'll leave you be the judge of that, but in my personal opinion, all he's done is essentially tanked his own life. Now, it would be improper of me to condemn or to tear down Jan Palach in the same way. The man is, after all, a symbol for the Czech people and the Czech nation. I just bring him up here as an example. Jan Palach could not have imagined that in 20 years, the Czechoslovak communist system would be no more, that the Soviet Union would collapse, and the Iron Curtain itself would fall. I bring up his story to show you the tragedy of despair. It often blinds us to possibilities that may well be just around the corner. History, it often moves in ways that we cannot predict, and what seems permanent can often change overnight. That fact is ultimately what leads Jan Palach's story to be one of tragedy. Tragedy being that if he had just lived another 20 years, he would have seen his country evolved into what he had hoped it could become. The lesson that I take from the Jan Palach story isn't that we should pretend to never feel despair, or that we should always be blindly optimistic about the future. No, I think both of those extremes are quite naive. The lesson that I take from this is that we should never let our own particular despair become so total that we give up on the possibility of things changing for the better. Sometimes, if we're patient enough and if we're persistent enough, if we refuse to give up hope, even when hope seems completely absent, the world that causes our particular despair can collapse under the weight of its own heaviness, and then we can stumble forward into the blinding light of its aftermath. Or, as the great Czech playwright Václav Havel put it, the real question is whether the brighter future is really always so distant. What if, on the contrary, it has been here with us and around us for a long time already, and only our own blindness and weakness has prevented us from seeing it within us and all around us, and kept us on developing.
Vzpomněl jsem si na svou mílu, krásně jsem si zapulil. Když přijela po půl roce, měl jsem zrovna zápal plic. Po chodbě furt někdo chodil, tak nebylo z toho nic. Neplačte vy, oči moje, ona za to nemohla, protože mladá